Brian Leonhardt here with the Leonhardt team at Coldwell Banker Realty. Today we have on a special guest here. So Taylor, how old are you?
18.
18. All right. I think at this point, as you, are starting to get into real estate, understanding of what don't you understand, what knowledge you're looking to gain, I think, or, your generation and your friends that might have questions. If you had a real estate agent in front of you, what questions would you ask on home ownership and selling a house, which is probably a long ways down the road. But I think just for buying what questions would you have, I think, to prepare yourself?
Yeah, being 18, I think, and going into real estate, I feel like a lot of people my age, they don't really understand buying a house because they don't really teach that in school. Sure, there's like some personal money management stuff, but this is the biggest purchase of your life. This is important, and it's not something that I feel like my generation really knows about. It's like, I'm moving into an apartment, I'm renting. It's like, that's what you can do, right? That's what most people do, but it's not financially, I don't know if it's the smartest idea, I feel like my question, if I didn't know anything about real estate, is be like, okay, why shouldn't I rent? Right?
Yeah.
Like, why should I buy then? Why are people telling me like, okay, maybe you should buy?
Yeah.
Why are people telling me you should rent? Finding that situation and, just making yourself aware is what I think is the biggest thing.
So here's my advice I think I would give is I think it's important to start, I think, with renting for the most part. You'll understand how to maintain a house, right?
True.
Your parents do most of that for you now, right? I think that understanding when you have an apartment, it'll bring things to light of what does break down, how do you fix them, or who do you get in touch with, typically a landlord, to do that. But I think the important thing for the younger generation to understand when you're buying a house is really important that you make sure that what you buy you're able to stay in for a fair amount of time. Where when you're young, I think you need the flexibility of going, I'm only going to be here for a year or 2 years. Your life is going to change dramatically in the next 5 years, the next 10 years. So I think going from when you're 18 or 19 and going, this is where I'm going to be at for the next 5 to 10 years is really hard for you to judge. So I think that at the beginning stages of starting renting, I think is a good idea, unless you can get yourself into a situation where you buy a property that you can potentially rent out afterwards, would be an amazing decision to do. But I think that that's hard to do, I think, at that age, for sure. Obviously for qualifying, obviously for a litany of reasons. But I don't see it as a problem to rent first, really,
That's true. Keeping that flexibility, because you are young and some people will take a gap year and then they want to go to college. I think it's true. It is a lot of because you're on your own, your first independent step, you know, and renting is that, okay, you're definitely, that independence piece is still there for sure, but it's not that ownership piece, when you have a house, you don't have a handyman.
Yeah.
You got to do it all on your own, and you have to pay for that too, right? If I'm renting and say
your water heater goes out, you call your landlord.
Yeah.
Right. You have that little gap of protection, right. But I think the biggest thing is the fact that you have the flexibility to be able to move. True. I think the one thing that I think is important for your age to understand is when that time does come is how long do I rent? When do I buy and why should I buy? I think that maybe gets lost. I think the important thing to realize is when it comes to home ownership, one of the best things about it is the fact that it's almost like a forced savings. So when you buy a house, let's say you buy a house at $200,000, right? And then your mortgage payments each month, part of that goes towards the principal, right? So you're paying down the price of that house, right? So let's say 10 years from when you buy it, the house doesn't appreciate at all, which rarely is the case. On average, it's about 3%. But let's assume that it didn't. At the end of those 10 years, you're still going to have a good $50,000 in equity. So if you're 20 years old and you buy a house, and by the time you're 30 years old, you technically have about $50,000 there. That's a significant amount of money. And I think understanding that the earlier you're able to do that and the shorter of a loan term that you have, the more equity you're really going to pay down. So I think that concern of going, oh, well, Bitcoin goes up a lot faster than housing prices do. I'm like, yeah, they also go down a lot faster than housing prices do. But then also I think looking at that piece inside of it to go, this is really a forced savings and I'm paying down this mortgage. And I think understanding that is a piece of understanding how rental properties work too. When you have a property that doesn't appreciate, but you're not technically paying the mortgage because you have a renter in there, that's still being paid down. So the longer you can hold on to that, the earlier you start into buying a house and starting in real estate, the more equity you're going to end up having in the long run, if you can hold on to it long enough. That's the most important thing. I think the biggest success stories I see with younger people buying those second houses is really when they bought really young. I've had a fair amount of them where they've been 28 and they move into a new construction, into a move-up house, because they're able to take the equity they had from their first house and move it into that next house. And now they've had a house where they can raise an entire family in, and they can be in for a really long time because they started early. You know, that's very different than somebody that buys their first house, you know, when they're in their mid 30s. It's really hard to get into that upper price ranges or those step up home prices without having a house that has some equity in it. That's maybe one of the more important things to realize of the importance of the equity in your home and building wealth and getting to those next levels. I think that's really important. What would you say is the biggest misconception that your generation has about real estate and home ownership?
Geez, good question. Misconception. I might have to think about that one. I think a lot of, in my shoes, like when I'm looking at, say, like buying a house, it's a lot like you see how much money that you're putting into it at first. And if you compare that to renting, it's like a fraction of the cost, right? That you're putting into it. But you have to think when you're buying a property, it's long term. You're getting that money back, as you said, like at what, 3% appreciation in 10 years, right? You're getting that appreciation. When you're renting, granted, you're not putting that money into it, but it's an investment. You're seeing it come out later on. Yeah. And I think that's like, sure, you're sacrificing that money now, but it's gonna come back at you.
Well, I think the clarification on that too is, you know, when it comes to how much does it cost to buy a home, there's a lot of first-time home buyer programs that are 3% down. Right. So it's usually just 3% of the total purchase price of the mortgage, right? And so that, or there's FHA, which is 3.5% down. But realize all that money goes into the mortgage automatically. Yeah. Really, the only cost that you have that you can't obtain in the future is the closing cost, is the 2% it costs to originate a mortgage. So when it looks like it's a lot up front, it's really more so the down payment, which pays down the house already. Let's say it costs you $100,000 to buy a house, right? And that's your down payment, and you have $100,000 to put into it. If you're not, let's say you get the seller to cover the closing costs. Well, in reality, you're just taking $100,000 and putting it into the house up front. So if you sold it the next day, you get to take out that $100,000. So realize a lot of the costs that it's attributed to buying a house really comes from that down payment that you're required to kind of cover. So that 3%, but realize that goes into the home that you do access when you sell the house.
Right. And I think realizing that there are programs for first-time home buyers, it's not just like that 20% down payment that I think people rarely ever do 20% down. Yeah. There's plenty of programs that you can use that will help you out. It's endless too. And I mean, there's so many options out there and so many different places that you can move into. Like I'm looking and I'm like, there's like condos that you can buy that are, I mean, like $5,000 for a down payment with like the FHA. It's crazy. Yeah. And then your mortgage is probably like around like $1,500, but that's not including like HOA and insurance and stuff like that. But I mean, renting is, I feel like, pretty similar in costs. Yeah.
Well, I own a few rental properties, and it's typically first month's rent and then the security deposit, which is, you know, that's 2 months of rent, right? And then on that, if that's at $2,000, I mean, that's $4,000. So if you find a house for $200,000 at 3%, it's just $2,000 more. Right. So I think understanding that it doesn't take 20% to get into a house and knowing that you do have options, I think is really important.
Right. The way I think about it anyway is if I'm looking at a property, okay, look at the down payment. You have, say, $5,000. That's all you need to get into a house. I mean, to acquire the house, right? I mean, there's other costs like moving, you know, HOA fees, insurance, tax, all that stuff. But like to just the house itself, the down payment's like $5,000. Yeah. I mean, if you have that money plus some more, I mean, you can get in there, and it's actually possible. I think exploring your options, I think if you're just sitting and be like, okay, renting, I think in a lot of cases, I mean, being young, it is a good option, right? But if you're not exploring your other options, then it could just be the wrong decision, and you don't want to make that decision. You want to have the choices to be able to know all the information before you jump into something so important. I mean, this is where you live, where you watch yourself grow up. You know, it's so important.
Yeah, I think what happens a lot of times when people start renting, it's very easy just to re-sign the lease. And they don't ever really look at, could I buy a house?
For sure.
Should I buy one? You know, I think that a lot of times it's just simpler just to re-sign the next year's lease. Yeah. But I think also a lot of mistakes we see happen with renters is their lease comes up, you know, in a month and they go, hey, I might want to buy a house. And it's like, well, 1 month isn't going to be enough time for you to buy a house. So I think understanding the timeline for how long it actually takes to buy a house, I think is important. Is realize that to obtain a mortgage and to close on a house, even even if you did pick out the house and everything is all set up, it's still going to take you over 30 days to be able to close on that property, be able to move into it. So starting that process, I would say at least 3 months before. That's probably kind of like your deadline time. But 6 months before, I think, is really important. I think also realizing you probably have a lot of plans to be able to talk to your landlord to be able to go, hey, is there an option for me to get out of my lease? If you can find somebody else, or if I can find somebody else, you know, I'm looking to buy a house. I think a lot of times, especially in the way the rental market is going right now, is they can find somebody else, maybe even at a higher price than you're currently in at. And they may be open to being able to do that. So I think if you do rent, is asking that question to go, hey, if I did break my lease a little bit early, I've been here for a couple of years and I've been a good tenant. You know, I think a lot of times landlords will allow you to do that.
Yeah, for sure. When you were young, did you ever rent? What did you do? Like, did you ever rent? Did you just jump into owning? What did you do?
So when I was in college, I rented. So my first house that I moved into, we rented that when I was in college. And then after that, I went and I lived in Oakland when I was playing football. We rented when I was there just because I knew it wasn't going to be a long period of time that I was there. But I think once I got into my third year in the NFL, I bought a home back here in Minnesota for the off season. So as soon as I knew I was back in Minnesota, I knew that that was going to be a place where I was going to, you know, stay for a long time. I bought a house as quickly as I could, really. But I did have a couple of stops where I did initially rent a couple of times, just knowing that the time frame was going to be a shorter amount of time before I found something that I was going to be in for a while.
How long, if somebody is deciding on renting or owning, how long do you think they have to be there to make it where they should think about purchasing a home?
It's a great question. I think I'd like to have it where it's like I could probably be here for 5 years. You know, 3 to 5 years I think is important. And then going worst case scenario, at least 7 years. I think that's kind of the longest time frame I think you have for a housing market to kind of drop a fair amount for you to get your equity back, is that 7-year time frame. But I think as long as you're in it for 3 to 5 years and see yourself in it for that amount of time, I think that's probably the sweet spot. And that kind of depends too. And I think as much as you can protect yourself is finding a property that you can add value to, something that maybe is a little bit uglier, that doesn't have a lot of overhead expenses like windows, roof, furnace, but just looks a little bit like grandma and grandpa's, right? And some paint will make it look nicer, redoing the floors and adding value to that house, I think helps shorten that time frame where people, you know, can be in it for a year or two. And if they add that value to it, they can gain a lot of equity on that house.
For sure. And I feel like even if, I'm not totally sure, but even if you do say, I have a house for 3 years and you sell it, granted you have to like pay like closing costs and stuff, but you would still come out with benefit, I would assume, right?
Yeah. I think realize that, you know, it's probably somewhere around 6 to 8% of increase is probably about what you would need to get that money out. But realize that even if it's that on the appreciation of the market or the appreciation of that house because you added value to it, realize you've been in it for a couple of years, so that principal pay down has happened. And whatever you had for a down payment before is still there as well.
I wish I could see the math behind this, where like how much you could actually get if, say, you are there for like 3-5 years, which I feel like a lot of people, when they go into like a lease, I feel like they are there for, I would guess, around that amount of time. How much, if they went into a house and said how much money they could gain by that'll be scary math. Okay, let's say what's average rent in Minnesota. Let's say it's somewhere around 2,000. I think it might be high, right? But let's call it 2,000, and you're there for 3 years, right? So 2,000 times 12 or $24,000 a year. Times that by 3, you're at $72,000. So it'll cost you $72,000, right? So now let's say you buy a house and you have closing, and you buy a $300,000 house, and let's say you cover your own closing costs. So that essentially would be a 6% or a $6,000 cost to you. And then in 3 years, let's say a 3% appreciation each year over 3 years. Man, this is a lot of math I'm not even doing in my head. So that's $9,000 a year times 3 is $27,000, right? So you're positive $27,000. Let's take out, you know, hey, you sell the house. Let's say it costs you 6% to sell the house. So 6% of $327,000. Tawny, can you give me some math? $19,000. So you're still ahead $8,000. So you're either ahead $8,000 or you're behind $72,000. Right. Yeah.
Wow, that's I haven't never done that math before, but that is some giant math.
Isn't that astonishing?
Yeah, that is the difference. Yeah. You can either, and that doesn't include principal pay down at all. So, but it also doesn't include home maintenance and everything. But the difference is you're ahead on one situation. You're really far behind.
For sure.
On the other situation.
I mean, look at that money. You could put that into, like, say, even if you are there 3-5 years, okay, now you're ready to, like, if you are ready to upgrade, okay, it's happening. You could find your forever home. You have, what was it, $19,000?
Yeah.
Imagine the money you can use, and that could actually be your forever home. It's not impossible.
Yeah, I think the difference is on the housing cost of renting is you don't ever get that back.
Right.
I mean, I think that's the big thing. But it does provide you with flexibility. I think that's the important thing to look at. On an average 3% return on real estate market, you know, you're there for 3 years, you're definitely ahead.
I know. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, that is.
I just can't believe that. And even if you are just there 3 years, say, okay, I'm 18. Say I make that commitment and I do buy a $300,000 house. Okay, I'm there 3 years. 21. At 21 years old, I could buy a beautiful house that I could see my family living in for the rest of my life. I mean, I would hope that the house that I buy, I could potentially see myself living there for a long time. But if, say, I do 3 years is like the minimum, whatever, okay, $19,000. Imagine that down payment too.
Yeah.
And that takes off principal. So then your mortgage is going to go down too.
Yeah, that's very true. If you have any real estate related questions, put them in the comments down below and we'll answer them for you.